the Department of Social Work. Now, I would like to welcome Manu to please welcome our distinguished guests and participants to this webinar.
A fine morning to one and all, distinguished guests of the day, and my dear friends. It is with great pleasure I greet and welcome each one of you to today's session, which is in fact the fifth and final day of the webinar Aloft. We have with us Mr. Shabri Nair to deliver today's keynote address. It is indeed a moment of pride to introduce and welcome our honorable guest, Mr. Shabri Nair, who is a labor migration specialist for South Asia of the International Labour Organization. He provides technical advisory services to 7 countries, namely India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. He was leading the organization's work on the global migration policy and was a focal point for both Asia and the Middle East. He had managed several programs and projects in 13 countries across Asia and was also a member of the Swiss delegation to the Global Forum on Migration and Development. His service with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Organization for Migration needs special mention. Let me take this opportunity to accord a very cordial welcome to you, dear sir. My greetings to Assistant Professor Mr. Anish KK of the Department of Social Work, Thoravur Regional Center, who will be moderating this session. A warm welcome to you, dear sir. Let me also extend my hearty welcome to Professor Dr. Jose Anthony, who is the head of the Department of Social Work, Assistant Professor Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj, who is a program coordinator, Ms. Fatima P.S., who is the teacher in charge of this session, and to all our dear faculty members. Glowing welcome to you, Ms. Kesia Biju, who is the student in charge of the session, and all my dear friends who are participating in today's session. Wish you all a very fruitful session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. Our distinguished resource person of the day has joined us, Mr. Shabri Nair. He was leading ILO's work on global migration policy, including for the intergovernmental negotiations and adoptions of Global Compact for Migration and the newly established UN Network on Migration, with positions in both ILO headquarters in Geneva and at ILO's Office for the United Nations in New York. He was also the focal point for Asia and the Middle East in Labour Migration Branch. I would like to introduce the moderator of the event, Dr. Anish KK, Assistant Professor, Department of Social Work, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi. Over to you, sir.
Hello. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yeah. Since the organizers introduced about the speaker and the speaker bio and everything, so I think we can directly straight away go to the session. So, but before that, and I would like to say a few words, and the speaker Shabri Nair will talk on the impact of COVID-19 on international migrant workers at Aloft, and as we all know that it is a major concern for all of us, because Kerala has also a large number of migrants who work abroad, and at Indian context also, and they have a large number of migrants working abroad, and India is one of the highest remittance receiving country, because and many of these migrants have been reported to have lost their jobs, and many of them have been forced to leave their host countries without receiving their pending salaries and incentives. And there have also been numerous reports of wage theft. And another thing is that despite the existence of organizations such as we do have organization like the International Organization for Migration. So another issue I have is that the lack of global governance on international migration. And many of us are still clueless about the damage done by the COVID-19 to transnational migrations. And so I hope that this session will address many of these pressing issues and raising a few questions before us. And we shall, I think, we shall open the door for discussion after the presentation, and the questions could be posted in the chat room as well. So, and I would ask the participants to keep their questions within this popular topics that will allow us to stick on she do. And with all my humility, now I invite Shabri to deliver the talk. Over to you, Shabri.
Thank you very much, Anish, and what an absolute pleasure it is to be here. Can I quickly commend Manu and Safa for that fantastic introduction? In fact, when I was listening to Manu talk about my biography, I was thinking this is exactly how I would like somebody to talk about me. So thanks, Manu, for that, and Safa to you as well. Really appreciate it. And big thanks to Professor Jose Anthony and Reshma in the first place, who invited me to this particular conversation. So where do we start? I mean, look, one of the things that I took into consideration when I read the concept note was a very clear understanding that I'm speaking to a team of social workers or people who are engaged in social work who would like to look at the issue of migration and then see how best you can address the situation based on the needs and concerns of the migrants, or the migrant workers in the case of the ILO. I therefore felt, now this is the thing, having heard my profile, I'm sure all of you now are very aware that I've not been engaged in social work the way you have. I'm a policy person. I've been engaged in policy issues pertaining to migration and migrant workers. I've not necessarily had the experience of engaging at the grassroots level in the context of migrant workers. I think a lot of civil society organizations, NGOs, trade unionists who are working on the issue are much, much more aware of how it works at the grassroots perspective. But that said, what I wanted to perhaps give you then is the broader context of how migration has figured, particularly over the last few years, the last couple of years in the context of COVID-19 and the kind of issues that migrant workers have gone through. Now, I'm sure a lot of you would have heard about the ILO. If you haven't, I'm happy to give you a quick snapshot of what kind of an organization we are. ILO is one of the oldest UN agencies in the world. It's the third oldest, in fact, after the Universal Postal Union and the International Telecommunications Union. It was established in 1919, and it's the only tripartite UN agency. So what does tripartite mean? It is an organization that takes into consideration every aspect of labor, with the understanding that it has to be taken into consideration with the presence of governments, employers, and trade unions. So that's governments, employers organizations, and workers organizations. Without these three, the ILO doesn't function. So in any conversation that we have, all three come together. So in a way, if I have to talk about social work from the ILO's perspective, it would be that the hundreds of millions of trade unionists or workers on the ground, the boots on the ground, so to say, who are the social workers from the ILO's perspective, right? So that's really where the ILO comes from in terms of its background on on different issues pertaining to labor rights. Now, before I get into the perspective of how things have been over the last couple of years, it is important for you to know what was the situation vis-a-vis migrant workers prior to COVID-19, or particularly in terms of certain facts and figures. Now, I am not a big fan of a monologue, right? So please feel free to raise your hand, to put something on chat as I ask questions, simply because I like this to be a much more engaging and interactive session. Let me start with this. We're going to speak about migrants now. So, and this is the fifth day is what I heard from one of the speakers, the final day in the conversations. I'm sure this may have come up before, and if it hasn't, I'd still like to present it. Is this, how many migrants do you think there are in the world today? Please feel free to use the chat box if you don't want me to hear your voice, or if you don't want to turn on your video. And I can be a bit of a character in this. I will not move forward till I see at least one number in chat. Feel free to take a guess. There's no right or wrong answer in this, and this is certainly not an exam. It's just to get a sense of whether you've looked at it along those lines. Millions, says Kirti. You're right, Kirti. There are millions of migrants. But what do we mean again? Millions is, this could be tens of millions, hundreds of millions, a million millions. So what exactly do we mean? 10 million, Safa? Okay. So 10 million international migrants in the world. Adano number. Ellavarikku orappano that there are about 10 million international migrants. So I'm talking about the total number of international migrants in the world.
Yes, sir. I think Kerala has 2 million, 2.1 million migrants working in Europe.
Right,
So
Anish, thanks so much.
Yeah.
You're right. So how, if I were to expand that to total number of international migrants in the world, how much would that be? An approximation. Because I'm now hearing millions, I'm hearing 10 million. Is that what you think is the population of the world is how much? Let's start there perhaps. What is the population of the world? Social workers should know this, right? Have some sense of an understanding of who they're serving. What is that demographic dividend that we talk about? Anybody? 200 million, says Naveen PS. 127 crores. Somebody else by the name User. Thank you very much. Here's my thing. So let me be straight up. There is a population of about 8 billion people. Thank you, Reshma. Yes. So there's a population of about 8 billion people. And out of that 8 billion people, as per the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs data, this is from 2020, the last available data on the total number of migrants in the world. There are over 281 million migrants in the world. 281 million migrants in the world. Out of the 281 million migrants, and now that number is very difficult to, or it's difficult for us to say that it is the most accurate number, simply because that term migrants involves anybody who has moved internationally, across international borders. That includes my father, who moved in, or not anymore, but he moved in 1975 when he went to the Middle East as a migrant worker. That includes the Rohingya refugee who moved from Myanmar to Bangladesh. That includes perhaps my mother, who moved 6 years later to join my father in the Middle East as a member of the family. That includes people who have been displaced across international borders as a result of climate change, for instance. So it's a whole range of people who have been incorporated into this particular number of 281 million. So anybody who has crossed an international border. Now, within this 281 million, how many therefore are migrant workers? Out of the 281 million, the ILO's global estimates for migrant workers is about 169 million. This is the 2019 estimates. So once again, I am not able to tell you what the COVID, now as a result of COVID, what has been changed in the global labor migration, that is migrant worker scenario. I'm not able to tell you that simply because we don't have an estimate on that. So if anybody tells you this is how many people there are as of today or as of yesterday, don't take it into consideration because there is no factual evidence for it. The ILO has not yet released this data, right? So as of 2019, that is the pre-pandemic era, there were 169 million. Out of the 281 million migrants, there were 169 million migrant workers. Out of this 169 million migrant workers, can you tell me how many do you think came from South Asia? About 45 to 50 million. So about 45 to 50 million migrant workers came from South Asia. And I'm covering Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So from just 6 countries in South Asia, we have close to 45 to 50 million migrant workers out of 169 million migrant workers around the world, which makes South Asia the largest hotspot for migrant workers or labor migration in the world. These are people who are either moving within South Asia, or these are people who have left South Asia and moved to other parts, the Gulf, Europe, Americas, Southeast Asia. So that is Singapore, Brunei, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on in those countries. So it's a whole range of populace who has moved from South Asia. Now, within this context again, out of the 45 to 50 million migrant workers, how many do you think are from India? 18 million. India, therefore, is the largest migrant sending country in the world. So not just in South Asia, it is the largest migrant sending country in the world, 18 million. But this 18 million is out of a population of how many people in India? 1.36 billion. So out of the let's say 1.3 billion, out of the 1.3 billion, only 18 million are outside this country. Now that's less than a percentage of the population are outside the country. If you include diaspora, that's 30%. That's 30%, right? And sorry, that's 30 million, right? So it's still only about a percentage of the population that are really outside the country. Now, this also means that we have to constantly recognize in terms of policy how a government of India will react to migration vis-a-vis a government that is a central government, vis-a-vis the state government of Kerala, which has, and now coming to Anish's number of about 2 to 2.5 million international migrants from just Kerala. So out of that 18 million, about 2.5 million migrant workers come from just Kerala. So you see, why I wanted to impress on you this issue is, as a social worker, how can you break down this data, right? And once you start breaking down this data, you see a whole range of dynamics, including in terms of how countries will react to the issue, how governance, Anish mentioned about how bad the governance has become in the context of labor migration. And this is not just in any one country that I'm talking about, but labor migration governance has suffered around the world. So how can we use data for US social workers when you address the needs of the migrant workers? How can you use data like this to be able to better serve the needs of where they come from? I'll give you another example of data, and I want to stop at that, but I think it's important you know. Every time, as a social worker, if you go and speak, I've not done the work that you have done, but I can tell you this: if you go and ask somebody, "Endina migrate here? Endu karanam kondana naadu vittadu?" On what basis? You ask my father this when he left in 1975. He will tell you, "Njan 10th class pass aanu. എനിക്ക് വേറെ ഒരു ഓപ്ഷനും ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. ബോംബെയിൽ പോയി കുറെ ജോലി എടുത്തു. അവിടെ ബോംബെയിൽ ജോലി കഴിഞ്ഞ് I got an opportunity to do something better for myself, and therefore ended up in the Middle East." He came back 32 years later to, now my parents are now based in Bangalore. They're settled down there. He came back in that after 32 years working for the same company. All he wanted was to be able to make sure that he was able to give the best for his wife and son. I don't have any brothers and sisters, so for him, that is what family was about. But you ask him that question, it was simple perspectives. I want to save some money. I want to build a house. I want to make sure that if he had a daughter, he would have said this, as top priority. Molde Kalyanam. Even as a son, I think that was important for him. These were some of the perspectives that he went with. I can guarantee you. And this is somebody who I must say came back, flourished, in his migration experience, and came back with a positive experience, gave me fantastic education. I studied all around the world, and I've been able to now, as a privilege, work here. Now, think about those who don't have these privileges. How would they react to that question? Why did you migrate? What was the reason that led you to migrate? And one of the big aspects that they'll tell you is for us to be able to send back money for our families' survival, for our families' bread and butter, for our families' education, health, what we call social determinants. Now think about those people. In that kind of a context, you're speaking to people who are the most vulnerable of categories of people who are moving. And don't look at it from just the Kerala context, look at it from the broader India context, and you will see a whole range of geographical unevenness in the context of how migrants relate to their stories back home. The migrant from Kerala is not the same as the migrant from Uttar Pradesh, who is not the same as the migrant from Bihar, who is not the same as the migrant from Tamil Nadu. Right? So think about all those aspects in terms of how you want to relate to the issue. Now, why did I mention this whole idea of sending back money? Remittances. India in 2019, even 2020 World Bank data says over $82 billion India received. So even during the pandemic, India received over $82 billion in remittances. $82 billion in remittances is the highest in the world. You know who comes second? China. And you know how much they get? $69 billion. This is as per World Bank estimates. Huh? Where is $69 billion and where is $82 billion? Right? So even the second is not even a close second. Right? It's a very far second in terms of how much India has received. But this $82 billion, how much do you think it contributes to the national GDP? It contributes to about 2.6 to 2.7% of the national GDP. 2.6 to 2.7%. Nepal, on the other hand, in that same year, 2019-2020, received about $7 billion. That amount, which is lesser than 10% of what India received, contributed to 27% of the national GDP. The reason why I'm impressing on you figures like this is also for you to recognize how then countries will react to the issue. 2.6% of the national GDP is but a drop in the ocean. While that is not the case for Nepal, that 27% is almost 1/3 of their GDP. If that is the case, you can be assured that the government of Nepal is going to take an active stand on the issue of migration. Now, when I go to Kerala, I hear, and this is, you may actually have a better idea, Anish and the others, but I hear all kinds of stories about how much remittances contribute to the state coffers in Kerala. And I hear anywhere between 18 and 36% of the state GDP comes from remittances. I'm not surprised. There's a reason why we have high daily wages in the context of Kerala. And certainly, migrant workers' remittances from overseas contribute to the high daily wages. I'm not an expert on that context, but I will bet every penny that I have that there is a contribution along these lines. So therefore, do you think the state government of Kerala has a much active role in terms of how it approaches labor migration, protection of migrant workers from Kerala and so on? Yes, absolutely. Right? So I think it's important once again for us to dissect the data that we have for us to be able to react accordingly. Now, social work in the context of how you react to migrant workers, and NGOs or the others who are working on policy to how we look at it from the government side of things. Now, with this said, with this data given, let me go into the kind of effect that it had. And we heard Anish gave a few points with regards to the kind of effects that we saw migrant workers have in times of COVID-19. Let me start with the very first one. In February 2020, the WHO, my colleagues at the World Health Organization, very clearly announced we now have a pandemic. COVID-19, coronavirus, is now a pandemic. Within a month of that announcement, we and the rest of the world went into a lockdown. With that lockdown, the government of India engaged in the largest repatriation exercise the world has seen. Now, if anybody has followed the news, they would certainly have an idea of what this repatriation exercise was called. Anybody want to take a guess? What was the name of the international repatriation exercise that the government of India carried out when COVID-19 struck for migrants, Indian migrants around the world? No? No guesses? Vande Bharat. Thank you, Anish. I was really hoping somebody came with that, because if you didn't, I would have been very worried, given the fact that we are a state as Kerala that has faced the most number of returns, one of the most number of returns, and that we haven't read the newspapers. So thank you to Anish and Manu for mentioning that. The Vande Bharat mission. The Vande Bharat mission absolutely was the largest repatriation exercise that the world has seen in the history of humankind. It gives me goosebumps as I say it. The largest repatriation exercise. And it is important that you know that this repatriation exercise could not have been carried out by every government. In fact, I think, and I think the government of India is has really finessed this based on the first Gulf War in '91, based on the during the war in Yemen, the conflict in Yemen, Operation Rahat. If you remember, India was the country that evacuated over 45 different nationalities. People from all over the world were evacuated by the government of India because India knows how to get this done. And now, as a result of COVID-19, perhaps the biggest crisis that we can say we have faced in our generation, COVID-19, world over, the government of India was ready to bring back so many people. How many were those? If I'm not mistaken, the last count I heard was over 9 million people. That's over 90 lakh people from around the world were brought back. How many did I say were from migrant workers from India? 18 million. So more than half that population was repatriated back, right? Now this 9 million, the other angle to it is India also engaged in this Vande Bharat mission by evacuating people from India going to other countries. So there's a whole range of people that are once again involved there, and we don't have the specific data on that. But just so you know, so this is over 9 million Indians who were brought back into the country. The largest repatriation exercise that we've seen across the world in history, you know, time immemorial. And that's very special. I mean, this is bigger than the repatriation exercise that we saw vis-a-vis the partition, in terms of people moving between India and Pakistan. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. But I mentioned the repatriation exercise because who are these people who are coming back? These are people who are coming back after having lost their jobs. In fact, if you get a chance, and if you are having a pen and paper by your side, please note down this particular term. It's called the ILO's COVID monitoring report. So between 2020 and 2021, the ILO has launched a series of COVID monitoring reports on labor issues, how labor around the world has been affected. In that, one of the COVID monitoring reports, I think it was the 3rd or the 4th edition, the ILO's COVID monitoring report states in that edition that over 8 million jobs were expected to be lost just in the Arab states. It doesn't say which Arab states, it says just in the Arab states. Over 8 million jobs. I guarantee you, 18 million Indians around the world. Out of those 18 million, close to 9 million are just in the GCC. Over 9 million were repatriated from all over the world through the Vande Bharat mission. Out of the 8 million jobs that I told you were lost in the Arab states as a result of COVID-19, who do you think, whose jobs would have gone first? The national in that Arab state? Or the Indians, or the Bangladeshis, or the Nepalis, or the Sri Lankans, or the Pakistanis' jobs? It would have been the migrant workers' jobs that went first. And that is also important for you to keep in mind with regards to the kind of people who are now returning. I'm not saying all the 9 million who have returned are migrant workers who've lost jobs, but majority were them. Again, we don't have that specific number. So if majority of the people were coming back after having lost their jobs, think about how desperate they may have been. Think about how bad the situation would have been for them to have lost their jobs and now have to come back to their own countries. Now, pre-pandemic, before they even left for these countries of destination, like in the Gulf, like in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, you know that a migrant worker pays a lot of money in terms of recruitment costs. Recruitment fees and related costs are one of the highest expenses that a migrant worker has to pay for. These people have paid that money. They've borrowed it from a money lender. They have paid the recruitment agent. They have gone to the Gulf on a 1-year contract, let's say. When they reach the Gulf, they've now been told within a month, COVID-19 has struck, it's a pandemic, no jobs. You have to go back. Now think about what their situation is like. So they left in debt. They're coming back in a bigger debt with no job, no prospects. They have to now come back and suffer even more than what they were suffering before they left. This, my dear friends, is how bad this vicious cycle of migration can be if it is not dealt with or governed in the right and proper manner, right? Again, then, think about these people. So not just people who've lost their jobs, who are coming back, who are repatriated, but also people who've lost their jobs in the most difficult of circumstances. Now, as social workers, how will you deal with these people? I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm just thinking out loud with you with regards to how that can be dealt with. Now, these people who are coming back have to be reintegrated. Now, reintegration is a state issue. It's an Indian issue. It's a government of India issue. That needs to be a policy. There is no policy on reintegration. There is no policy in India specifically focused on migration. In fact, migration is governed by the 1983 Immigration Act. And hopefully there will be in 2022, this year, the revised immigration bill of 2021 will be adopted will be tabled and adopted in Parliament this year. Hope so. If that is the case, we have, even in terms of governance mechanisms, there's no specific policy. In fact, the only there are policies in South Asia. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh are two countries that have policies. Pakistan is already close to adopting a policy that is lying in the cabinet for approval. So we, on the other hand, have not yet gotten there, and I hope it really happens this year. Now, in the absence of a policy, there is no policy on reintegration. There's no policy on labor migration, and there's no policy on reintegration. 1983 Immigration Act is what we have. Now, all these people are coming back. How will they be reintegrated? The reintegration, where are these people coming back to? In Kerala alone has got 4 international airports, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Right? We have over 19 international airports all over India, or over 20 international airports all over India. Just international airports, not domestic airports. I'm not counting them in. Now, if there are 4 international airports just in Kerala, think about the number of people who are coming back to Kerala through this Vande Bharat mission. Out of this 9 million who are repatriated. They are coming back after having lost their jobs, or after living many years in the Middle East, for example, or having lost their jobs due to this vulnerability of the sudden lockdown, and businesses totally had to shut down. How do you think, as social workers, you would deal with the issue of reintegration of these people? There was even a moment, I remember conversations in 2020, where I had to spend a lot of time with people just in the context of trying to say, please don't blame the migrant worker as the carrier of infection. How are you going to deal with that kind of an issue? Yeah, because a lot of migrant workers were blamed for bringing COVID into Kerala, into India. And that is a horrible situation to be in. Because where else can they go? They've lost their jobs. They have to come back to their country. So they're absolutely treated badly there. And now they come back to their country and they're treated equally badly here. Think about that situation. They're treated badly not only by not only by their people, but their communities where they're living. So reintegration is not just a labor market reintegration, it's also a social reintegration. How do we ensure that social reintegration happens in a manner that is not detrimental to the life of these migrant workers? A lot of migrant workers who end up in the Middle East, and this is not just from India, but this is over, particularly I'm looking at the South Asian context, so this is no specific reference to India here. A lot of them go on tourist visas. They go on tourist visas, they try to get a job in the Middle East, they don't get the job, they overstay, they don't want to come back because they've already paid the recruitment agent money for that visa. Now they need to somehow recoup that money or get any job. What they do, they end up staying back in the Middle East. How do they end up staying back? Irregular, which is no document. Now, no visa, the tourist visa has expired. They've got a passport, the passport doesn't have a valid visa. Now think about these particular migrant workers in the situations of irregularity. Do you know how many of them were deported back to South Asia? Hundreds of thousands of them. In fact, at that time, Kuwait and UAE went into an amnesty program during COVID-19. The amnesty program was, if you are irregular, please come forward. We will give you a vaccination, or we will give you access to health. But the moment you register yourself, you have to leave. This was the basic principle on which Kuwait and UAE let out the amnesty program. How many people do you think, why did Kuwait and UAE do that? They did that simply because they know whether you are irregular or regular, whether you're white or black, whether you are, from the north of Kerala or the south of Kerala. I come from Palakkad, and when I speak in Malayalam, I know that most people laugh at me. But here's the thing, whether I'm speaking in Palakkad and Malayalam or Malayalam from Thiruvananthapuram, at the end of the day, COVID-19 is not seeing the differences between you and me. COVID-19, if we are human beings, we are going to get affected in some way or the other if we are not careful. It doesn't matter whether you're regular or irregular, with visa or without visa. If you need to get COVID-19, you will get it, right? So the idea was, then let's, in this case, and this is the reason by which they went forward with these amnesties, make sure that these people are not under the radar. They're not living under the security paraphernalia, right? Let's make sure that we bring them out, give them access to healthcare. If they have COVID-19, because if they get it, we will also get it. So we need to make sure that they also have access to healthcare. And if that is the case, now how many of these people have had to come back? So imagine those who are irregular, deported, coming back to their own place where jobs also don't exist. There is no social protection systems. And now you have to reintegrate them socially. You have to reintegrate them into the labor market. Think about what kind of scenario as a social worker you would have to deal with along these lines. That's in the context of irregular migrant workers. Now, think about those people whose wages were not paid. A lot of, and trade unions and the South Asian Regional Trade Union Council and Migrant Forum Asia. This is the biggest regional trade union organization in South Asia, and Migrant Forum Asia, which is the biggest civil society organization, together came along with a couple of other partners to launch something called as the wage theft campaign. They were saying that migrant workers' wages have been stolen. Their wages were not paid on time. What did I first tell you about remittances? Why do people leave in the first place to be able to send back money? How will they send back money? With the salaries that they get. If they don't get those salaries in the first place, they are affected. Their children, their families back home are affected. Their entire lives are affected. So on what basis are they? So they called it the wage theft campaign. Now think about those people, the transitional justice that is required for such people who are coming back now without having had their wages paid. How many people, and I connected to the previous sessions on mental health. Now imagine the trauma that they must have gone through. Imagine the commitments with which, the hopes, the aspirations with which they left the country in the first place, and now they have to come back, and how that must have hurt them. And that is, mental health. I came in only towards the end of the conversation, Reshma and Professor Anthony in the previous session, but I'm so glad I came in at least there to hear them speak, because I tell you, in the context of migration, mental health is rarely spoken about, right? So think about the broader public health concerns and the mental health concerns that migrant workers have in this context of people who are coming back, along the lines of including those who've lost their wages, for instance. I will maybe now begin to conclude, and I want to conclude specifically in the context of some of the bigger aspects of this conversation. First, I want to tell you about what we call bilateral labor migration agreements. So we've seen now how things have shaped over the last couple of years. We believe that it is important that countries have to reset their bilateral discussions. Okay, which means reset in the sense there are a lot of countries have bilateral labor migration agreements. These agreements are very clearly to say, for instance, somebody going from India to an X country X in wherever in the world, the two countries, India and that country, will sit together and they will discuss what exactly needs to be the conditions under which these migrant workers leave the country. This is a bilateral agreement. Now, these bilateral agreements can go in various different shapes and forms. For instance, there is one bilateral agreement between Nepal and Jordan in the context of migrant workers, women migrant workers from Nepal who are going to work in the garment sector in Jordan. Okay, in the textile industry, right? Garment sector. So these are women who are specifically recruited for that. They don't have to pay any recruitment fees. Now, I'm just going to digress for 1 second here, and that is, think of those women who are in domestic work. Domestic work is not even recognized as work in our own country. These are women who are going on so-called maid visa. In the visa, it says maid visa. When I hear that word maid, there's nothing that upsets me more, right? But the visa actually comes as maid visa. So that's how it is actually printed on somebody's passport. Now, that maid visa, the person who's going on that, and I keep insisting on this because we need to change terminologies, we need to change definitions, we need to change the way people think, and for that we need to change usage of terms like this. But think of somebody who's gone on that maid visa to a Gulf country, and that person has to now come back, or that person is affected much more than a worker in a company, because even in the Middle East or in India or anywhere else, domestic work is not considered as work. It's not considered as labor, which means there are no rules regulating the issue of domestic work. It's the same thing in the Middle East. At least in a company, if somebody is not paying, their wages are not being paid on time, the labor inspector can go into that company and ask questions. But in the case of domestic work, who's going to do that? Who is going to walk into a personal household to do that? So think about, as a social worker, think about it in the context of domestic workers in our own state and those who are coming back or who have been affected, our Indians or Keralites affected elsewhere, living elsewhere as domestic workers, working in households and don't have any access to anything. You know, during COVID-19, there are so many perspectives on domestic workers, women, migrant workers, particularly domestic workers came out. And that was in the context of, for instance, they worked much more than they did previously because now they had to, everybody isolated, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, everything was done by that worker. So think of, I mean, this is just a small example, but many, many different aspects came out at the time. And each one of these things have affected these people more. Now, coming back to bilateral labor migration agreements, how will we therefore understand the needs of what these people going through, what they need, and then trying to advocate it to make sure that when two countries sit together, the bilateral labor migration agreement is done in a way that is conducive to the protection of the rights of these workers, right? So as a social worker, that kind of information becomes very important for someone like me in policy, right? Working in policy, it becomes so important to be able to understand some of those specific nuances that a lot of people other than you may really be able to get. So in the context of bilateral labor migration agreements. The second thing that I also wanted to reiterate is specifically in the context of international labor standards. A lot of the ILO is the custodian of 190 international labor standards. In fact, the last convention that was adopted was 100 years later since the ILO's adoption. The 190th convention was adopted in 2019. ILO was established in 1919. In 2019, the convention that was adopted in the centenary of the ILO's establishment was the Convention to Eliminate Violence and Harassment at Workplace. How many migrant workers go through violence and harassment? Do you think non-payment of wages is harassment? If somebody's passport is confiscated, do you think that is harassment? If somebody is not, their contract is substituted, do you think that is harassment? Absolutely. These are also indicators for forced labor. So there is a very clear link between forced labor and harassment. So if you're harassed, you're in forced labor situation. And if you're in forced labor, then you're certainly being harassed in some way or the other. So labor standards are so important for us to take into consideration. International labor standards, and in terms of how they are translated to the national level, are so important for us to take into consideration as we begin to understand how to deal with migrant workers, to understand their specific issues. Now, the ILO and the United Nations together have 3 conventions. So Convention number 97, Convention number 143 of the ILO. So I told you there are 190 conventions. Out of the 2 conventions, 97 and 143, the ILO conventions, and the United Nations Human Rights Convention, which is the 1990 Convention for the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. These 3 conventions together form the triumvirate of conventions or protection standards in the context of migrant workers. So please, when you get a chance, do look at these 3 conventions in the context of social work, and I'd love to know how you look at it. That is important for us going forward, to make sure that these conventions are very clearly prescribed in the way government policies are written, right? Otherwise, we'll end up living in a world where things are not going to work well, because if you want to effectively govern migration, then you need to be able to make sure that that particular governance of migration includes labor standards from the international to the national perspective. And finally, I want to conclude with one point, and that is with regards to multilateralism. I'm a big fan and a big believer of multilateralism. I believe that nothing in this world, whether it is you and us, I think there are about 42 people in this conversation, is what I see from the Zoom participants link. This community, none of us can do without each other's presence. We are all equally, whether it's Professor Anthony's job, Reshma's job, Anish's job, Manu and Safa, in terms of how they introduced us, your presence here, what you go to take forward, what am I going to learn from you, what have I been able to impart to you. This in itself is a multilateral forum. Now think about this in the context of how countries have to come together, which means no conversation can happen without multilateralism, right? Particularly on migration, because it is about people who are crossing international borders. Think about the internal migration. I haven't even touched internal migration in this conversation. Now think about all those millions of migrants who walked back home from one part of India to the other part when the lockdown was announced. Thank God a lot of those migrant workers in Kerala did not necessarily have to go through. These are our own Indians living in Kerala. The xenophobic comments that I've heard from our own Malayalis in terms of saying, Hindikar or Bengalis, ഇവരാണ് നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിൽ വന്നിട്ട് ഈ problems ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നത്. Think about that. We don't need to really even talk about international migrants. We can start with regards to internal migrants and how social work can address that issue. But it is almost scary. But the point I mentioned this is because nothing can happen without countries coming together in the context of international migration and being able to talk about it. So if that is the case on international migration, on multilateralism, for countries to be able to come together, there are specific elements. Please read, and I'm sure you have, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development Goals, right? The SDGs. Migration is peppered across that agenda in various forms. Goal number 8 is on decent work and productive employment. Target 8.8 is specifically focused on the protection of the rights of all workers, including migrant workers and women migrants and others in precarious forms of work or of employment. See how specific that target comes in the SDGs. Right? So take that into consideration as you look at how this can be addressed, because the way social work can address it will then affect the way SDGs are implemented in our country. In fact, Kerala was recently given an award by Niti Aayog in the context of how SDGs are being implemented in Kerala. It would be great to know what has how has social work contributed to that specific agenda. That'd be a great research topic, if I'm not mistaken. So keep that in mind in terms of multilateral forums, right? There is another big multilateral document that came out, and you would have heard this from Manu's of introduction of mine. I was the ILO's lead negotiator for the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration. The Global Compact for Migration was negotiated by 192 countries in New York at the General Assembly in 2018. The 192, but the UN has how many member states? 193. Which was the one country that dropped out? United States. It was the Trump administration. They clearly did not want to have anything to do with migration or the Global Compact for Migration. So they boycotted the negotiation. 192 other countries negotiated it. Out of those 192, guess how many adopted it? 152 countries adopted it. India, along with all the South Asian countries, adopted the Global Compact for Migration. Very special, very, very special. It has now become the global reference document on migration around the world. You read that Global Compact for Migration, and I guarantee you, you will glean a lot of information in terms of these various issues that I have spoken about, whether it is repatriation or reintegration or recruitment or irregular migration. A whole range of these things are mentioned in that Global Compact for Migration. It's a 34-page document, so it is not too long. Please make an effort to read that document. But that particular document, when it was adopted and negotiated by 192 countries and then adopted finally by 152 of them, it came up with 10 specific guidelines. And I will leave you with those 10 guidelines to understand the importance of multilateralism. First, it said it is important for migration to be looked at from a people-centered perspective. People-centered is the work that you're doing, my friends. Social work contributes to a people-centered perspective. It's a migrant-centered perspective. Without that, there is no way you could look at it. The second, it says that migration should be governed by international cooperation. This is what I was telling you, between countries, whether it's bilateral, whether it's multilateral, between countries, cooperation, international cooperation. Third, national sovereignty. So these are guiding principles. So the first one is people-centered. The second one is international cooperation. The third one is national sovereignty. I have heard some countries take the floor or take the microphone and say that out of the 10 guiding principles, the most important for us is national sovereignty. How can you say that national sovereignty is the most important for us when you cannot have national sovereignty without having international cooperation? You cannot have international cooperation without some of the other guiding principles, which I will tell you in a second. So think about it along those lines. National sovereignty. How important is national sovereignty for us? Number 4, and it is important, it's a question of how well you can manage or govern migration along those lines. Number 4, rule of law. Rule of law without this is what I was talking about as an example in the context of labor standards. So rule of law is such an important element in terms of how labor migration or migration itself can be governed. Number 5, sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals is a good example along those lines. Number 6, that migration should be guided by a human rights-based approach. Again, who are the people on the ground to understand this best? Social workers. It should be able to be governed by a human rights-based approach. Number 7, it should be gender responsive. This is what I was telling you in the context of domestic workers, for instance. So how responsive is it to the needs of women, to the needs of men? Because both genders, gender doesn't just mean women. Let's make that very clear. But if that is the case, men have different needs, women have different needs. How exactly are we going to reconcile these different needs? So how do we have a gender responsive approach? Number 8, child sensitive approach. Right? A lot of the children left behind, a lot of the children who are moving around, all of these issues. How can we make sure that children are accommodated in this conversation? So human rights-based approach, gender-responsive approach, child-sensitive approach. Who is best placed for that information? Once again, social work. Number 9, whole of government approach. Whole of government approaches in India alone, just during the repatriation exercise, the Vande Bharat mission that I spoke about, almost all the repatriation that happened with the coordination of the Ministry of External Affairs, in collaboration with the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Why? Flights that are necessary to bring back people. Ministry of Health, Ministry of Skills Development, because a lot of people, their skills were being profiled. They're coming back. What kind of skills do they have? How are they reintegrated in the local labor market when they come back? All of these things. So all these ministries had to come together to have a coherent approach just for Vande Bharat mission. That's what we call a whole of government approach. Now, in some cases, they say that they, not in India alone, but in every part of the world, they say there is no whole of government approach. There is a whole in government approach, right? And that is something we need to avoid. For that, once again, what kind of evidence can you get from the ground? And the last one, whole of society approach. There is no conversation of migration governance without the presence of trade unions, civil society organizations, employers organizations, and private sector, humanitarian workers, migrant rights organizations, social workers, the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, the media, all of these are part of the bigger, broader societal approach. So what we call the whole of society approach. That's your 10 guiding principles. Each one of those guiding principles in which you personally can have a hand in terms of how we take it forward at the policy level. With that, I don't know who to give the floor back to. Anish, to you perhaps. Thank you so much. That's been my time.
Yeah. And thanks, Shabri, for bringing this engaging discussion. Because let me, before concluding, before opening the floor, and I'll say a few words. And so what I understood from the talk is that there's all kind of mobility, including international migrations were seriously affected by the pandemic. And the pandemic.
Anish, sorry, you're breaking up. Anish, you're breaking up for me at least. So maybe if you could put the microphone closer to you.
Yeah, sure. So am I audible now? Yeah. Yes. So the all kinds of mobility, including international migration, were seriously affected by the pandemic, and the global pandemic has also slowed down the demand for global migrant population. And the pandemic has also caused the setbacks in remittance flows, and from especially from low to middle income countries. And the speaker has Shabri also attempted to historicize the migration process from his own experience. His father being he's a migrant laborer in the Middle East, and he contextualized the migration patterns, its economic ramifications, and diversity of migrants on a global level. And he has also pinpointed some policy prescriptions, especially aimed at tackling the issues of international migration and for upholding the rights of workers. So since he's an academic, policy person, the things which has been taking place in the academics, I would say a few words that the academic debates mostly largely focused on remittances and its ability to shape the economy and other things. But what I feel is that though it's a transaction like remittances, it is a very complex process. We don't generally go into that kind of these processes behind these the economic transactions and all. So I think these the discussions must go beyond these narrow confines of economism, and we must attempt to reveal the details of these processes instead of focusing on the mere outcomes, economic outcomes, and monetary transactions. So and that's all from my part. And I think we can open the floor for discussions. I think the participants may ask the questions, and you can ask the questions in the chat box as well. Yeah.
So can I ask a question? I will start the question answer session. Can I? Okay, thanks, Shabri, for this brilliant, look into the very close look into the international, how policies are made internationally, and like to share a personal, history with you. I also have a father who went to Saudi Arabia precisely in 1975. So it's amazing how personal histories come together.
Our fathers should meet. I'm sure they have a lot to exchange.
Unluckily for me, my father is no more.
Right. Sorry, Reshma. Yeah.
He has written a lot. He has published a lot about his life during that time. Yeah. So what I wanted to ask is something that I taking from Anish's Anish's observation about how like you economicize, or like you try to talk about migration mostly in terms of economic outcomes, remittances, and things. Like even when, like lot of stories or like academic books that I have read on migration, especially like women migrants going to Trinidad, for example, not just recently, like during the colonial period, and many migrants histories also focus, of course they focus upon remittances and having a good life for their family. That is one focus, but there was also many stories which talk about migrants leaving their native places, their homes and families, due to persecutions, maybe patriarchy, to have a better life, not just in monetary terms, but also as an escape from many other social cultural factors. So like if our international migrant policies are just concentrating upon the monetary framework, then like I think we need to make these policies much more complex, including other socio cultural factors as well. So you, as a person who is very familiar with the international migrant policy makers, I'm sure you might also be taking into consideration those factors. And I was curious to know, like how do you actually go about doing that? Like you can have these bilateral discussions with the governments, and then you can have, like very clear cut policies about how monetary how intake should be done, and how that should be regulated, and how what kind of support system should be given. So even in the COVID times, like for a woman migrant, or a migrant who is due to political persecution, or for a sex worker, or for a trafficked person, or for a transgender, or a gay person who is migrating, it's not just about the like there is a lot more than just the monetary consideration by coming back. And many of them, as you said, will be undocumented migrants as well. So what, like how can our policy reflect all these social cultural factors as well?
Thanks, Reshma. And I'm glad you bring it up. Reshma, I think we have moved from there. Huh? See, when I gave you, for instance, the remittances figures, I gave you the remittances figures on the basis that this is how a lot of governments think. But that has changed in the context of how we drive policy. Okay. So even in the ILO, though it's the labor organization, which has a massive impact in the context of the econometrics of labor, even we look at these issues from a social angle, right? And that is because when we sit in those discussions with trade unions will talk to us about the real life stories that these migrant workers are going through. Trade unions are not going to come back at us and tell us, this is the overall economic situation of migrant workers. They're going to tell us, this is how my worker there is going through. This is the kind of situation they're in. This is the kind of situation their families are in. Their children are not able to go to school. So they are going to bring in the whole social aspect. And so a lot of policies today are driven by that. I mean, take for instance the Global Compact for Migration, those 10 guiding principles that I told. Whether it's a human rights based approach, a gender responsive approach, a child sensitive approach, a whole of society approach, nothing on these happens without the social implications of migration, looking at the social costs of migration, right? However, what I'm saying is as policy drivers, I'm not a policy maker. As somebody working on policy issues, that is certainly how we bring up the element of conversation. That may not necessarily be how a government thinks. Okay. And that's where that gap lies. We need to be able to change the thinking. So for instance, one of the things we say is, can we not say, a lot of governments, when they come to the table, they will say, we receive this much remittances. Okay. We say, great. But remittances is not your money. It's not the government's money. When your father, Reshma, or my father sent back money from Saudi or other parts of the Middle East, wherever they were, they sent back money to their personal account for our use. Your family's use, my family's use, that is what it was for. So remittances is personal monies. It is not for anybody else's use. So even there is a social context to that conversation, right? In terms of how money can be used. So in the broader scheme of things, this is certainly what's happening. The gap is being bridged. It is taking us longer than necessary, but just so you know, social, I mean, I won't go into details. Read the Global Compact for Migration, and you'll see a whole range of social issues that are being discussed within that Global Compact for Migration in terms of how migration should be governed. So that's certainly happening.
I think like a lot of discussions are also going around trafficking, how we can distinguish between migration and trafficking, and also like you have UN protocols regarding trafficking, and then also you have groups of the trafficked persons who argue that some of these protocols are not empowering them rather than making them that's not considering their rights, their voices. So, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, no, certainly that is certainly happening. Let's just, you mentioned protocols. So you mentioned trafficking. Now, Reshma, what if I turn around the question to you and talk about smuggling? How do you think people who are smuggled look at the issue? In India, we look at trafficking, and usually the connotation to trafficking is sex trafficking. Okay. There is a whole range of people who are trafficked for labor. Right? And there's no conversation about them. Those people in forced labor, majority of them are trafficked. Those people in brick kilns who make bricks are trafficked people, right? And there's no conversation about that. Smuggling, the reason why I bring it up is because as per international law, that is the Palermo Protocols, you are a victim of trafficking, but you are an object of smuggling. So what if you're smuggled, you're not a victim? So I wanted to get out. Why is the person called an object of smuggling? Because that person is giving money to somebody to be smuggled out of his or her bad situation. Okay, so those people who cross the news stories that we hear, international news stories about somebody who's reached the UK or Italy by boat from north of Africa. Those kinds of conversations are about those people who are smuggled, right? This is the reason why the law is very blurry. The law is very blurry because they tend to look at these people as having caused their own issue, that they were responsible for this in the first place, that they handed over money in the first place to be smuggled out of that country. But the problem is, it is such a gray area with regards to how a smuggled victim can also become a trafficked victim. It is such a gray area in terms of the fact that these people are forced to leave, and that is the reason why they're forced to get into that conversation. This is very difficult, and this is where labor standards or international law, issues like that are still constantly evolving, right? And then now try translating that into our own conversations, right? So trafficking, very specifically in the context that you asked, is a very important issue, is a big issue, is one that is not being addressed as much as we want to address it. I'll give you an example. Workers who go from our state, let's say from Kerala, right, or elsewhere in India or other parts of South Asia, who go from here, who pay such high recruitment costs, end up in those countries, and then their passport is confiscated. That is clearly labor trafficking. Okay, it leads into forced labor, but it's a traffic-like situation. In Bangladesh, in 2020, the government of Bangladesh and the ILO engaged in a survey. And the survey was to identify how much money migrant workers paid as recruitment fees and related costs. Now, you may say that is looking at the economics of it. It's not. It's really to understand what kind of situation migrant workers put themselves in, right? Believe it or not, the survey came up with the following result, that migrant workers in Bangladesh were paying an average of 17.5 months of their salary for recruitment fees and related costs. 17 and a half months, Reshma. I mean, 1.5 years of a migrant worker's wages is going as recruitment fees and related costs. If that is not trafficking, I don't know what is. If we cannot link that to trafficking, I think, we may as well stop doing our job. But that conversation is one that we have to take very gradually into the policies levels. It doesn't happen overnight, right? I mean, can you imagine, even for a government or anybody to even engage in those kinds of surveys shows the government's commitment to try and eradicate that situation, right? But that's also not easy. So just to give you a broader perspective on these issues, I mean, it's a constant challenge for us, and your point is very well taken on that.
I think for those who are listening, like if you can't ask the question in English, please do ask in Malayalam. I'm sure Shabri will be able to understand your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very happy to reply in Malayalam. It'll be Palakkad and Malayalam, so please don't make fun of it.
Okay, Shabri, I was listening to you. It was really good to have a profiling of what is happening in the international domain with labor migration. And specifically, I was really happy to listen to that 10 or 11 points you have specified as a list where social workers have to focus upon and work up in labor migration process with. So I have a very specific question to you. Like, usually the migration is a temptation to make the economic identity consolidated. Specifically, a labor migration is a temptation to make your economic identity.
Let me write that down. That's a very interesting way of putting it. What was it, Professor?
It's basically it's a temptation to make your economic identity consolidated, because at home I'm not economically powerful or engaged or considered, and I'm tempted to take the other land.
Okay.
So that I will have a labor opportunity over there, a better labor opportunity, better earning opportunity, so that I can make my economic identity solid, consolidated. And I will have more purchasing capacity, more bargaining capacity. So I take all this risk to migrate myself. So this is usually what happens in the labor migration. We have different types of other migrations, but labor migration, this is the most common phenomenon I think we are familiarized with. And this process of making my economic identity a solid, powerful, or empowered identity, I compromise my cultural, religious, political, social, even psychological relationship, familial identities. I'm risking them.
Sorry, before you even go any further, on what basis are you making that statement?
Because once I leave my homeland and go to a foreign country for a labor, I'm primarily considering my economic stability or economic identity.
You're totally mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
You're totally mistaken.
If it is for labor migration, what is the other motive then?
No, but see, you're looking at this purely from the word labor.
Yeah.
Don't look at it that way.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Gulf.
Mm.
You know where I grew up? I grew up in Qatar, where over 90% or close to 90% of the population is migrant.
Yeah.
Out of 2.25 or 2.3 million people, about 2 million people are migrants.
Yeah, I agree.
I had a better understanding of my country living in the Gulf.
Yeah.
Growing up in the Gulf.
Yeah.
I had a better understanding of my culture growing up in the Gulf.
Yeah.
Outside of Kerala, better Kerala food you get in the Gulf.
Maybe. I don't deny anything of that sort.
The cultural aspects of who I am have been deeply driven into me. I know how to read, write, and speak in Malayalam because I went to an Indian school where it was important for my parents to insist that I learn to read, write, and understand and speak my mother tongue.
Yeah, in Gulf it is okay because we have that much big diaspora over there.
Correct.
We have
it is a big
diaspora over there.
Correct. But this is, again, you cannot stereotype it to every country as well.
Shabri, I'm not trying to stereotype it, but I'm just trying to put it this way. Usually, when we analyze the people who are migrating from the homeland, they are all looking for a better economic position.
Better life. No, better life, sir.
Yeah,
better life. And that life doesn't have to just be an economic situation.
But when we interact with them, because I have a lot of my students, a lot of my relatives, my people who have migrated from Kerala to different parts of globe. And once we know that their economic status have really gone up. They have money with them. They have the purchasing capacity now. They have the bargaining capacity now. They have taken their family situation in the homeland very much economically better now. These are realities. But on the other side, many times they say, they share that they have really lost with their roots here. And that roots, I don't say they have to be here. Nothing of that sort. I'm not talking about the nostalgic feeling. But they primarily lose their roots here slowly. Their children are growing up over there. They cannot come back. So they have this identity conflicts with it, where they have to locate with. They are neither here nor there. Slowly they grow there and they become a part of the diaspora there. That is true. But this process of feeling uprootedness of the labor the people who are migrating from here to other country
is identity question.
Yeah, that is basically our conference is working on the identity perspective. How this identity, this dislocations are working on the identity formation, identity systems, and how they have this fragmented feel of identity once they are moving on, and they are slowly getting settling over there. This is what I believe. That's why I said this economic stability may put them in many other crises. Once they come back to the homeland again, maybe on vacation or after they get a TR and coming back. I think these are also concerns where they cannot have a settlement like. They have left their homeland. They have worked maybe for 20, 30, 40 years in another place, and in their later part of the life, old age, or after their middle age, not maybe even with the old age, they come back, and they again find this inability to get engaged in the homeland. So this is what I think identity conflicts, identity crisis, dislocations they face with. What way we address this internationally?
I don't think there is one answer to your question. I think it's a very important point that you raise, and this identity conflict is something that I hear about very often. I don't think, and I'm not an expert on it, but let me try and answer it in my own simple way.
Yeah, it's because it's a discourse only, no? So we can discuss about.
No, let me reflect on this now. One is the identity of the Gulf Malayalis, for instance, or the Gulf Indians is very different to the way the Indians or Malayalis outside the Gulf react.
Very true. Very true.
Okay, so that's first thing. So that is out of 18 million Indians that I told you who are overseas, 9 million are in the Middle East, in the Arab states.
Yeah.
So let's keep that out.
Yeah.
Now the other 9 million. In 2020 January, I had the opportunity to participate in the as an observer in the Loga Kerala Sabha, which is organized by the state government of Kerala. I was invited to Thiruvananthapuram for the 3 days. I met Malayali diaspora from all over.
All over.
Right? And identity is a conversation that they have. Now, this is specifically in the context of first generation Malayalis, so second generation
Very
Malayalis.
true,
So
very
this
true.
is not necessarily, again, the Malayali who has migrated is not the one that has the identity issue. It is the children or the grandchildren who have the bigger identity issue. The other element that need to be looked at, and let me bring in the government perspective. You see, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1945, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were drafted, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about Article 13 of the Declaration is specifically on migration. And that there are two clauses in Article 13. The first clause talks about the freedom of movement within a country. Okay. And the second one is the freedom to leave your country when you want and return. Okay. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize that to a large extent, migration governance contributes to identity politics or identity factors. So if a government has not put policies in place that are conducive to the return of people to their country, if the government in question has not put in policies that are representative of the voices of their people who are living outside the country, then that affects the identity of those people. In fact, recently I was in a conversation with a good friend of mine from Lebanon. Lebanon is a country which has close to 5 million people. The population of Lebanon is about 5 million. But there are about 15 million Lebanese.
Outside.
So per capita, it has one of the biggest diasporas in the world.
Yes.
Right? So 75%, in a way, if you can say it, 75% of Lebanese are outside Lebanon, living in different parts of the world, in different stratas of life, right? Now, all of these people are still very closely associated to their country. And in a way, the reason for that is because there is a very strong pull factor.
Yes.
Okay. India may not have that. But again, may not have that because I told you only less than 1% are outside the country.
Yes.
Okay, so when we talk about identity crisis for migrants, we have to really understand to what level we are going to in terms of identity crisis. How many people are there who are going through this?
Yeah. I just add one factor, one point. You were talking about the pull factor and the push factor. They have gone because of the push factor and they may come back with the pull factor. In Kerala, we are experiencing a different, very, very peculiar, I don't call it a practice, a phenomenon now. A generation who have traveled from Kerala to European countries or Euro-American countries maybe, have bought a lot of land in Kerala once they had money. When they went there and they started working there and earning there, what immediately they did was they purchased the land on homeland. They constructed a beautiful house over here. But now they are into their 60s and many of them are getting retired over there. And their children are getting settled over there. They got married there, and they are not going to come back now. So a trend that is coming in Kerala is they are disposing their homeland now. That means the land they have purchased, the house they have purchased. I know people who have even disposed the so-called kalaras in cemeteries because they are not going to come back. they have bought a place in cemetery,
For
but
their
they're
burial.
selling it. And a second phenomenon, second system working is that the current generation going abroad, that means people who are in the 30s or 40s now, are not at all investing on land. They're not at all constructing a house. A third generation who are going to abroad as study purpose and work purpose. They are not even bothered to come back.
Right.
So these trends are talking about this dislocation experiences. In Kerala, I believe this economic
Sure.
condition slowly turns into a different dimensions now.
Sure.
These are observations.
Agree.
Yeah.
Agree. Let me ask you something. If somebody does not have a job,
Yes.
what in the ILO we call it decent work.
Yeah.
Decent work. Decent work is comprised of 4 pillars.
Yeah.
Productive employment,
True.
social protection,
Yeah.
social dialogue. Social dialogue is when government, employer, and trade unions come together to recognize the right of that worker.
Yes.
That is a part of decent work. And the 4th one is international standards, labor standards that I spoke about.
Yes.
Decent work, if that is not available, people will
That's the most
move.
important push factor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in that process, if they think their identity will be compromised, to be very honest with you, Professor, I don't think they care.
Yeah, that's it. See, I'm not making a moral judgment on it.
Yeah.
I have no intention to make a moral judgment on it. I don't say whether I'm not talking about the rightness or badness of it. I was just talking about the phenomenon.
No, sure. And but for me, that phenomenon arises as a result of the lack of decent work.
Yeah, underemployed situation in different ways.
Absolutely.
Ways.
The number of
Because,
people in our country who are working in 3D jobs, what we call dirty, demeaning, and dangerous.
True. Very true. Coinage is excellent.
Essential workers. You know that Swiggy delivery boy.
Yeah.
Okay. Or the domestic worker. Today, they are our essential workers.
Yeah. Considered.
Right. But we do not even consider that perspective. Now, the nurse, India is one of the largest, may I quote unquote use the word export, export migrant workers.
Yeah.
And they export nurses, right? After the Philippines. India and Philippines are the 2 of the biggest countries of migrant workers from where nurses come, right?
Yeah.
Why are nurses leaving our country?
Yes.
I mean, when we think of this,
we are equally competing with the nurses now, social workers.
Exactly. So there's a whole range of issues there, but I fully take into consideration what you're saying. I have a better idea now of what you were coming at.
Because
thank you.
I'm working here as an educator, and during last 3-4 months period time, I've written reference letters to 40 of my students who are trying to migrate.
Right.
And the push factor is so solid in India now. Push factors. I don't call it factors.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was
absolutely.
really enriching,
No doubt.
Shabri. Great.
No, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Reshma, for the invitation. I'm really glad that I was able to have this conversation with all of you. It makes so much of a difference because, as I said, I remember when Reshma, you sent me the concept note, we had this conversation about identity. Now, how do I come in with the whole identity conversation or, social work, because that is not my background, but I really wanted to spin it in a way that we can see that connection. And I think, I've learned from both of your questions as well in terms of how you look at it.
And also
I really
a personal compliment, Shabri. You sound so good, and your eloquence is superb. So I think my students have a lot to learn from you.
Oh gosh! Well, thank you so much for that. I will give the credit for that to my parents.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, and wish you all a very good conclusion.
Anish,
please.
Anish, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. Okay. I think there are not many questions. I think, yeah. So we can give it to the the organizers. If somebody is Are you guys actually proposing a vote of thanks or something?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Anish.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the best said vote of thanks.
yeah. They will.
Hope they come up to your expectations.
Safa?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you
Proceed.
so much, sir. That's a very vibrant and very lively session. So now I would like to invite Miss Lulu to deliver the word of thanks.
Hello, good afternoon.
May I make a request? It's just that I like to see faces. I think it's so important. If you please feel free to turn on your videos, huh? Unless you're in a situation
Safa,
where your looks are
Anish,
compromised. But it's always nice to do that.
Maybe because there's what to say?
Anish is straightening his shirt. I get it.
Okay, maybe because the network has some trouble.
Yeah.
That
No
may be the thing.
No
Anyway,
doubts.
good.
No doubts.
You
I'm
should
just
say,
used to
welcome to
seeing.
the world of academics.
Yes.
And that's how it happens now. You don't see the face of our...
And that's the funny thing. Because in policy, it's very difficult to have a conversation without videos on. You're already doubted, so you better turn the video on. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Lulu, please. Sorry.
Okay, so am I audible?
Yes, Lulu.
Okay, a very good afternoon to all. It gives me immense pleasure to express my sincere gratitude to all dignitaries gathered here. First of all, I would like to thank our Chief Guest, Mr. Shabri Nair, Labor Migration Specialist for South Asia, an international labor organization, who honored this function with his great knowledge and reflective thoughts. We are enjoyed your beautiful presentation and to us very informative. Thank you, sir, to be with us and also enriching us. A big thanks to Dr. Anish KK, Assistant Professor, Department of Social Work in Regional Central Thuravur, to make this session a successful one through his moderation. And I thank all our teachers in the Department of Social Work for guiding us in the proper way to make this webinar an auspicious one. Our students made a great effort to coordinate this event and making it successful. Thank you, friends, and I would like to greet and acknowledge all the participants who made this event a lively one, and thank you all.
Thank you, Shabri, because he was he himself was having COVID when I contacted him.